The tools needed for this service are a small set of wire clippers. We prefer a butane torch to an electric torch, but some sort of heat device that will shrink the heat shrinking and burn some coating off of copper wires. We also need a set of zip tie snips or regular snips, a Sharpie marker, a bundle of zip ties. We'll need a socket wrench with the 9/16 socket and a 6-inch extension. We'll need a large set of crimpers with a 10mm size crimp, a large set of wire clippers, and a Scotch-Brite pad. So although this service is just going to address a few wires in this generator box, we want to make sure to get your eyes on every single wire that you can possibly see. Inspect for any damage, any separation at the eyelets, any abrasion of the insulation of the wires, any spot where rubbing could occur. You want to make sure that any of those spots are also addressed and replaced if necessary. A quick reminder, this is a very high voltage area and serious injury or death can occur if you get your hands in here without knowing what you're doing. So please make sure that the machine is turned off and there's no power going to this box before getting in there. So here we see an older style generator box, and you can see exactly why we're making this change. There's too much slack in the cables as is, and they're allowed to rattle and they shake up against this edge here, causing the insulation to be worn through and potentially shorting the entire system. So this will eliminate this problem for all future generator boxes. All right, so here we have an older style generator box as well, and we're about to perform the service to change out these cables and make it so that the abrasion does not occur. You can see the T4 and T7 cables, we've already gone ahead and performed the swap, and we have a brand new set of cables and looming that is connected to that terminal. So the rest of them have not received this service. We're gonna go ahead and do that right now. It's a good idea to take a picture of what it looks before you do any work here, just so that you know exactly which cables go to each terminal. So document what it looks like before, and you'll have a reference to put it back together once you have performed this service. The first thing that we need to do is remove some of the existing cables so that we can get access to the terminals. We'll be using a torch inside the box, so we want to get all of these cables out of the way so we don't cause any unintentional damage. One word of caution before you do any of this service: make sure that you do not drop anything inside of the generator. We don't want zip ties or any washers or nuts, anything. You don't want to drop it in there because it's impossible to retrieve it once it has fallen inside of the generator. If you do have a piece of metal or a zip tie fall into the generator, this is what you can expect to happen. So this is the inside of the generator, and you can see those two holes that you want to be very mindful that you don't drop anything into. If you do, this will happen. So word of caution, this entire generator has been destroyed simply because a small particle ended up inside. So we are being very mindful not to drop anything into the hole as we remove these 3 wires. Just go ahead and zip tie these 3 together and make sure that they're out of the way. Now we have access to these other terminals, so we're going to go ahead and remove the nut and the washer. And just peel back the wires, get them out of the way. And now we have access to the next set of wires that we're going to address. The next set of wires are the T5 and T8 wires. So once we have access to those, we can take out the slack and reloom them. So at this point, now that we've exposed some of the wire that we're going to cut back, we want to install our bracket. And the purpose for this bracket is so that we have another point of stability to tie this cable off to coming off of the generator. For now, we're just temporarily putting the nut on the bracket just so that it can be held in place, and we're going to use it as a guide to see how much wire we need to cut off. Once you have the 2 wires firmly in place, take one of the eyelets and place it over the terminal and kind of gauge the amount of wire you're going to need to go into the eyelet. It's a good idea to mark where you want to cut with a Sharpie. Each wire is going to be cut twice, and the reason for that is we want to leave a little extra to be trimmed once we have the final placement. So leave wire a little beyond where the metal enclosure comes from the eyelet, and then we'll trim it back once it's in place. These cables are labeled if you go far enough down the original looming, and it's a good idea to just write that label on the cable if you can't see it, because it will be eventually wrapped up. So just go ahead and label the cables before you cut them, just for safety's sake. All right, we're gonna start with just one of these cables, and you can see we have a rather large set of cutters. You're gonna need a large set of cutters because this wire is pretty thick, and you can see the wire inside of the insulation here. That's exactly what you're cutting. All right, so now you're gonna take a small X-Acto knife and cut back about 1.5 inches of the insulation. And we're just making 2 slits on either side, and then we'll cut around to remove that insulation entirely. Once the insulation is removed, you should have 1.5 inches of exposed copper. Each one of these copper wires is dipped in a special coating before it's installed, and that's just basically a shielding to make sure there's no excess noise outside of these wires when they're collected together. So we're going to need to burn back that coating on each one of these individual strands. This is why it's important to remove the individual cables that were in the way before. So now we have the ability to get a torch in here without burning any of the other parts of the system. This process is somewhat tedious in that you have to do this for every single strand of copper, but you can see that once the orange flame disappears, that's a clean burn and your copper is ready to be scrubbed. We just use a standard Scotch-Brite pad and we just pull it up and around all of these burnt copper ends. Once any burnt coating is removed, you can see fresh copper. And the fresh copper looks very different from the coated copper. As I mentioned, that coating does provide a bit of sheen, so the exposed copper is a lot more matte finish and a little bit lighter in color. As far as the tool that we're using, this is a Bernzomatic butane torch, and it does not give off that much heat. It's a smaller torch, and this is the preferred tool for this job. When you get a larger torch, number one, it's harder to maneuver. Number two, it's harder to regulate the heat coming from the flame. So we want something that doesn't throw a lot of flame and is semi-easy to control, and this is the perfect tool for the job. It's important to apply heat to wires individually for 2 reasons. Reason number one is if you're trying to burn 2 or more wires at once, there's a possibility that certain areas of the wire are occluded from one another or the heat, and it's not getting a clean burn. The other reason why you don't want to burn more than 1 copper wire at a time is that you can generate too much heat and it will travel down the copper wire and actually set the insulation on fire. So avoid applying heat to more than 1 copper wire at a time. I know it's tedious, but this is the only way to do it correctly. Also, we hope that it goes without saying, but just in case you need the reminder, be sure not to inhale any of the fumes coming off of the flame or the wire as it's being burned. These are chemicals that should not be inhaled, so take note. Now we have the wires fully flamed and they're cleaned and Scotch-Brited, so we're going to trim off the ends, and we do that by separating them into 5 and 5 just so that we can have a better handle on the wires that we're maintaining. And again, you don't want any of these wire ends to end up in the generator, so make sure that you move them over as you remove them. Now we're going to do the other 5 wires, and the proper technique is to actually hold the wire ends against the cutter as you remove it. So once you remove the whole thing, remove it as one unit until you're free from the generator. So now our wire ends are flamed, Scotch-Brited, and clipped. Now the next step is to add a little bit of heat shrink to the insulation where we cut so that there's no water ingress. So you have to bundle all of the wires together, all of those copper wire ends, and work the heat shrink just back until it's just barely covering the white insulation, the original insulation on the wire. We find a 2-inch piece of heat shrink is the best application here, and if you overlap the white insulation by an inch or so, that should be enough to make sure there's no water penetration in that cable. Once the heat shrink has been worked over the folded white insulation, we're going to add the eyelet. And since your cables are already bundled due to the heat shrink, it should be relatively easy to get that eyelet on the cable end and under the heat shrink. The eyelet that we're using is a 3/8 terminal eye size with an 8-gauge wire inlet. Your crimping tool may differ, but just make sure that it has a 10mm spot to crimp this eyelet. This is a 10mm slot on this crimper right here. When you crimp the eyelet, make sure the pyramid side is on the bottom of the eyelet. Make sure you add a fair amount of pressure to crimp that eyelet. Then, if the heat shrink needs to be worked back up, just make sure that it's worked to the very end of the wire on the eyelet so that we have good coverage for the heat shrink on both sides. So once we have the heat shrink shrunk, we're going to add our label tag so that we can once again understand what cable this is that we're hooking back up. Since we made a handy dandy note on the cable previously, we should have no problem identifying this cable. This is the T5. Next, we will repeat the exact same process for the other cable in this bundle, the T8 cable. We're cutting right at the mark that we made with the Sharpie. And again, you're going to need a heavy-duty set of cutters because this is a thick set of wires. Next, we will make 2 slits in the insulation about 1.5 inches down the existing set of wires. We will cut that insulation away, revealing about 1.5 inches of copper wires. And again, you'll remember that we have a special coating on each one of these wires. This is where we burn the coating and reveal fresh copper underneath. So, once again, we will do this process. It may seem tedious, but it is absolutely necessary. So now our second set of wires has been flamed and scrubbed, and we are removing the tips. Once again, be sure to place your finger over the tips and remove them as a unit. Next, we will apply our heat shrink. We're just gathering all of the wires in a tight little bundle and working the heat shrink down again until about 1 inch of it covers the white insulation. Once the heat shrink is appropriately placed, we'll add the eyelet just as before. Next, we will crimp the eyelet. Make sure the pyramid side again is on the bottom and crimp. Once our wire is crimped, you can apply heat to the heat shrink once it is placed appropriately. Again, we want the top side of the heat shrink to be all the way up against the eyelet so that we can make sure there's no water getting inside of that connection. Be sure to add the appropriate label to this cable, which is the T8 cable. And now both cables have been trimmed and re-eyed so that we can mount them up using our bracket. But before we do that, we're going to need to apply some looming to the set of wires in order to just keep them in a nice tight bundle. So depending on what number mower this service needs to be performed on, prior to mower 20, you may not find looming inside of this generator box. After mower 20, chances are you'll have looming that was installed from the Firefly factory. But if you have one of the older mowers, then you'll have to add looming to the entire bundle. All right, once your looming has been placed and you clip any excess, then we're going to place our bracket where it needs to be. So we removed the nut and now our bracket is free floating here So we're going to apply a fir tree zip tie so that we have two spots where the cable can be zip tied nice and organized. So once those fir tree zip ties have been placed on the flat side and the bent side, go ahead and put the T5 cable on first and then the T8 cable. With the shorter amount of cable, you may have to twist the eyelet slightly just to get it down the threaded post. Once you have both cables in place, apply a washer and add the lock washer and then screw on the nut. One thing to note, be sure not to use power tools to tighten down these eyelets on the terminals. Power tools can damage the system, so just make sure you use a hand ratchet and tighten it as tight as you can with your hand. Use your 9/16 ratchet to tighten down the nut. Now with the fir tree zip ties installed, it's just as simple as closing the zip ties around the two cables to tighten them in place on the bracket. Snip your zip tie ends and this terminal is complete. So the process for this third terminal is exactly the same as what you just witnessed, so we aren't going to film that, but just know that this other side of 3 terminals will get reorganized. We will have some overwrap for these sets of wires as well, but we aren't going to do the entire process. So just know that this third one is the last one that will be exactly like the previous. One thing to mention on this third set of cables, these set of wires have a lot more length than the other ones just due to how they come out of the generator. So some of your wires will be longer than others, and these particular wires have a situation where we're going to have to cut after the label. So if that's the case, you're going to want to make sure to label the wires below where you make the cut, because once you cut them, you may not be able to see which side they came from. Also, this particular set of wires has a metal set of labels. We're going to have to remove those because I do believe they are right on the cut as well. All right, we've just replaced the nut on our third terminal after cutting and shortening each wire. Now the last thing to do is just enclose the zip ties around the wires on the fir tree and secure them to the bracket. So replacing the other side of the wires that we took off so that we could have access is also going to require a few different steps. We're going to cut all of the zip ties holding them together, and we're going to install some zip tie swivel saddles to better handle the carriage of these wires. And here's an example of one of those swivel saddles. Anytime you have wires that are not running parallel or need to be affixed at an angle or a 90-degree angle, then we will utilize these swivel saddles and they will allow the route to go without pinching the wires or bending them in any way. If your generator box has wires that do not have looming, then we want to add looming to any bundles just to add any protection. So these wires should have looming all the way as far as you can get that length, and then they can be affixed back to the terminals in their order. Again, we're using the washer, lock washer, and nut progression for holding on each set of wires to the terminal. In order to prevent the cables from twisting as you tighten them, it's a good idea just to hold them in place before you tighten down that nut. And then once it is tight, they should remain in place. Next, we're going to re-zip tie these cables so that they don't rattle, shake, or move in any direction. So just go ahead and bundle the 3 that we just affixed and tighten those down right there. This next one, you're going to utilize the swivel saddle by bundling all of your wires together and making sure that the zip tie is captured by that saddle. So just run it right through the saddle and it should stay put and not move anymore. So once again, the split looming will be utilized for this set of wires and any other smaller bundle of wires that is exposed. And then we have the more heavy-duty overwrap that gets added to all of the main wires coming out of the generator. So 2 sets of over protection for those wires that will be sent with this kit.